and how a woman who had fought him over the placement of a hedge and the pricing of a horse had not fought at all for this. He set down the pen. He did not require gratitude of himself for the steadiness of his hand. He required only that it hold. It did, until he reached for the estate ledger to close it for the day, and found it already open to a page he had not opened, marked at the corner with a single fold. The ink beneath one column of figures wearing a small, deliberate dot beneath each altered numeral, dozens of them, patient as stitches. He did not know that hand. And yet, he did. He had watched her make marks like it 100 evenings by the fire, teaching Diana her figures, humming some old tune her father had taught her, and he stood now with the ledger open before him and felt, for the first time since the ink had dried on the deed, something colder than grief. It was not suspicion of her. It was the sudden, sick understanding that he had signed away a woman who had left him a message in the one language she trusted him to read, and that he had been too busy losing her to notice she had spoken at all. 6 weeks, Sir Thomas had said. Alaric closed the ledger and opened it again and did not close it a second time. She had come to Lark Hollow 4 years before that afternoon, in a plainer season, in a plainer dress, hired at 19 shillings a quarter to teach a motherless girl her letters and her sums, and the first thing the new Duke of Ashcombe had said to her, across a desk stacked with unpaid bills his brother had left behind like a debt of temperament as much as money, was not a greeting at all. "Miss Fairweather," he had said, "I am told you keep accounts as your father kept them. I have no patience left for flattery in this house. Tell me honestly whether you can make sense of what I cannot, or tell me honestly that you cannot, and either answer will serve me better than a curtsy." She had looked at the ledgers piled before her, at the ink gone brown with age and worry, and she had said, without curtsying at all, that a column either balanced or it did not, and that flattery had never once made a number smaller. Something in his face had moved then, some plate of grief shifting a fraction beneath the surface, and he had said, "I do not require your gratitude, Miss Fairweather. I require your honesty." She had given it to him for 4 years, in ink and in argument, in the small daily proofs of a marriage neither of them had planned to want. Her father, Josiah Fairweather, had been parish clerk in a village too small for its own coach stop, a meticulous man who had taught his only daughter to read a ledger the way other fathers taught daughters to read music, by ear and by patience, until she could find an altered figure the way a bird finds a worm in turned soil, by the smell of the disturbed ground. He had taught her, too, the clerks tell, a private mark, a dot beneath a numeral that had been changed, a hairline slashed through a letter corrected in haste, so that if ever a page were tampered with after her hand had passed over it, she would know, and know precisely where. It had seemed, when he taught her, a game for a rainy schoolroom. It had not seemed, until Lark Hollow, a thing that might someday matter more than her own name. Mrs. Trilby, the housekeeper, had watched the new companion arrive with her trunk roped shut with string rather than leather, and had said to the scullery girl within Louisa's hearing, "Well, she's poor as a church mouse and plain as a Tuesday, and I dare say she'll last a fortnight before her ladyship finds a reason to send her off." Louisa had lasted 4 years. Mrs. Trilby, in time, became the nearest thing to a mother the house had left in it, blunt as a poker and twice as warm once the fire caught. And it was she who said, more than once, that keys to a house are the truest ledger of who is trusted in it, and that she had never yet handed her ring of keys to anyone who did not deserve the weight of it. She had handed them to Louisa within the first winter. That, more than any vow spoken later in a cold chapel, was the real beginning of the marriage, though neither of the principals understood it as such until long after the fact. Lady Seraphina Vane, dowager, widow of the Duke's late uncle Lord Reginald, managed the household accounts and Diana's trust with a gentleness that unsettled Louisa long before she could have said why. She never raised her voice. She had never needed to. She wore black bombazine 3 years after her mourning might decently have ended, and she touched the jet brooch at her throat when she was displeased, the way another woman might have touched a blade. "My dear Miss Fairweather," she had said, in that first winter when Louisa had asked, mildly, why the tenant relief accounts showed a deficit against the previous quarter's ledger, "I have managed this family's affairs since before you were out of the schoolroom, and I find that gratitude travels better than curiosity in a house such as this." It was said with a smile. It was, Louisa understood only later, the softest threat she would ever receive, and therefore the one she ought to have feared most. The wider world, once the marriage was made and the companion became a duchess, reacted as such worlds always do, with wagers laid at the club on how long a clerk's daughter would last among people who dined off silver she could not have priced, with callers who came to look rather than to visit, with a particular glittering coldness from Miss Constance Ray, daughter of Sir Godfrey Ray, who had been given every reason by Lady Seraphina to expect the Duke's hand herself, and who now sat in Louisa's drawing room sipping tea as though the cup itself had personally offended her. "You manage the trust accounts now, I collect," Constance had said once, watching Louisa's ink-stained fingers with open distaste. "How very useful you must be." Louisa had not risen to it. She had only said that usefulness was a poor sort of virtue to mock in a house that had needed it badly before she came, and Constance's mouth had thinned into something that was not quite a smile and not quite a retreat. It was in that same season that Louisa found the first small thing amiss, a column in Diana's trust ledger that would not balance by £4, 6 shillings, a sum too small to trouble a magistrate and too precise to be an honest error. She had marked it in her father's tell and said nothing to anyone, filing it away the way her father had taught her to file every question that did not yet have an answer worth its asking. The intimacy between the Duke and his new Duchess, when it came the way Mrs. Trilby had always said the best things in that house arrived, quietly, over work, without anyone announcing that anything had changed. They kept the estate accounts together on wet evenings when the roads were too poor for calling, Alaric squinting at figures with the particular scowl of a man who distrusted his own arithmetic, Louisa correcting him without once making him feel small for needing it. "Your uncle's steward kept these books the way a magpie keeps a nest," she told him once, "everything shining and nothing sorted." And Alaric had laughed, actually laughed, a short, startled bark of a sound that seemed to surprise him more than her, and Mrs. Trilby, passing the door with a tray, had stopped dead in the corridor and gone very still, because she had not heard that sound in the house since before the old Duke's funeral. It became, without either of them naming it so, a thing Louisa watched for and privately counted, the way a woman might count the days of a fever breaking. She confessed to him, that same winter, that there was a matter in the trust ledgers she could not yet lay plainly before him, a discrepancy she wished to be certain of before she named it, for fear of naming an innocent hand in error. Alaric had not pressed her. He had only said, "And I do not require your certainty proved to me before its time, Louisa. I require that you tell me when you have it." It was, she thought later, the truest vow either of them made in that house, truer than the one spoken before a clergyman, because it asked nothing of her but honesty on her own schedule. She meant to keep it. She meant to bring him the £4 6 shillings and the dot beneath the altered figure and let him decide what to do with his aunt's gentle hand on the ledgers. She had not yet done so when the letter arrived that made the question moot, and worse than moot, dangerous. The letter came in June, delivered not to Louisa but to Alaric, unsigned, purporting to be a note in Louisa's own hand arranging a private meeting with a Mr. Ferris at an inn 2 villages distant, warm in its language, in a way that made Alaric's stomach turn over before his mind had finished reading it. He did not show it to her at once. He carried it in his coat for 3 days like a stone, and it was Lady Seraphina who found him with it, who touched her brooch and said in the gentlest voice in the room that she had feared something of the kind for some time, that a woman raised so plainly could hardly be blamed for finding a duke's fortune a heavier burden than his affection, that she herself had seen a Mr. Josiah Hale, a clerk lately taken on to help with the estate correspondence, carrying letters to the receiving house that were not, she thought, entirely in the way of business. "I tell you this only because I love this family," Seraphina said, "and because I would rather you hear it gently, from me, than cruelly, from the county." Alaric confronted Louisa with the letter in the library, the same room where 6 weeks later he would sign the papers that ended it. He did not shout. He set the letter on the desk between them and said only, "Tell me this is not your hand, and I will believe you before I believe the ink." Louisa looked at the letter for a long moment. She recognized, with a cold and separate part of her mind, the very loops and crossings her father had taught her to make, copied with a skill that frightened her more than the accusation itself, because it meant whoever had done this had studied her correspondence closely enough to steal it whole. She thought of the trust ledger, of the £4 6 of what would happen if she said plainly, "This is forged," and demanded the county magistrate examine the trust accounts alongside it. She thought of Diana, 17 years old, whose signature Louisa had once seen appended, half-formed and trusting, to a blank sheet Seraphina had asked her to sign against some future need, and of what Seraphina might make of that signature, if pressed. She said, at last, "Only, I cannot yet tell you what you wish to hear." It was not a confession. Alaric heard it as one. That was the trap closing, though neither of them named it so at the time. The very quality in her that he had married, her refusal to speak before she was certain, became in that hour the evidence that hanged her. The weeks that followed were fallout of the quietest, most devastating kind, all withheld words and closed doors, Alaric moving through the house like a man carrying a wound he refused to let anyone dress. Sir Thomas Pell, called in to draw the separation, sat with Louisa alone one evening, and, not unkindly, said what he had clearly been asked to say. "Your Grace, forgive me, madam, I ought not yet call you so. Given the circumstances, there need be no scandal in this, if you are sensible. A sum has been mentioned. Enough to see you comfortably settled, quietly, without the necessity of the county learning more than it must. You need only sign, and go and say nothing further." Louisa had looked at him with an expression Sir Thomas would describe to his wife that night as the stillness of a woman refusing a blow without letting her face report the cost of it. "I do not want his money," she said. "I have never wanted his money. If I sign, it will be because I choose to go, not because I have been bought to." Sir Thomas had not known what to make of a woman who refused a settlement offered in earnest kindness, and said as much, and Louisa had only asked him to strike the sum from the deed entirely, which, bewildered, he did. It cost her a comfort she badly needed, and could ill afford to refuse, and she refused it all the same, because to take his money would have been, in the ledger she kept in her own heart, a debt she was not willing to owe a family she meant to protect rather than profit from. It was the last week of that season that Seraphina came to her directly, without Alaric present, touching her brooch, speaking in the softest voice Louisa had ever heard her use. "My dear," she said, "I have always admired your economy of feeling. It would be a pity if Diana's name were drawn into whatever the magistrate might make of a full inquiry into these letters. A girl's reputation is such a fragile account, is it not? So easily overdrawn and never quite made whole again. I should hate for her signature to be found on papers she does not fully understand the nature of." Louisa understood, in that moment, precisely what ledger was being balanced and against whose name, and she said nothing further to anyone about the £4 6 or the dot beneath the altered figure, or the letter's stolen loops. She let the separation proceed unopposed, not from guilt, but from arithmetic. Diana's safety weighed against her own name, and the sum was not close. The darkest turn came on the very morning of her departure, when Alaric, unable to sleep, had gone down before dawn to find Diana already awake in the breakfast room, pale, twisting a lavender ribbon between her fingers until it frayed. "Louisa is leaving today," Diana said, "and I do not understand why she will not fight it, Alaric. She is the only person in this house who ever asked me what I thought before telling me what to think." Alaric had no answer for her. He had, by then, begun to notice things he had not let himself notice, while the letter sat like a stone in his coat, the way Louisa flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever Serafina entered a room, the way the trust ledger, when he finally thought to examine it properly, showed a hand beneath the surface hand, alterations layered like sediment going back years, each one small enough to escape notice, all of them together amounting to a sum that made his mouth go dry. He said nothing of this to Diana. He went instead to his study, where Sir Thomas waited with the deed for signing, and he signed it, because Louisa herself, when he asked her one final time whether there was anything she wished to say before the ink dried, had only looked at him and said no, and squared the papers on the desk, corner to corner, with the small, precise gesture he had watched her make over 100 ledgers. A gesture that meant, he would understand only later, that she was holding herself together by main force. She left an hour after the ink dried. She left the estate ledger open on his desk, marked at the corner, the dots beneath the altered figures patient as stitches, a message in the one language she had ever fully trusted him to read, and she had trusted, in the end, not his belief in her innocence, but his competence, to eventually find the proof of it himself, without her having to spend Diana's safety to hand it to him directly. Alaric did not understand this until the wheels of her chaise were long gone down the lime avenue, and by then, the darkest question of all sat unanswered on his desk in her own father's cipher. Not whether she had betrayed him, which he now doubted with his whole chest, but who else had known enough of her hand, her ledgers, and her love for his sister to build a trap so patient it had taken 4 years to spring. He did not sleep that night, nor the next. He sat with the ledger by candlelight, tracing the dots beneath the altered numerals until his eyes ached, and it was Mrs. Trilby who found him at 3 a.m. and said, without preamble, that she had known something was rotten in that house since before Miss Fairweather ever came to it, and that keys to a house tell you who is trusted in it, but a ledger tells you who is robbing it, and perhaps, Your Grace, it was past time he read both. Alaric sent for Sir Thomas Pell at first light and laid the ledger before him, and it was Sir Thomas, examining the trust accounts page by page, with the neutral, unhurried patience of a man who had spent 40 years finding truth in other people's arithmetic, who first said aloud what Alaric had not yet dared to. These alterations predate Miss Fairweather's arrival at this house by 2 years. Your Grace, whoever made them has had access to this ledger since before your marriage was ever considered. Alaric felt something in his chest that was not quite hope and not quite horror settle into a single cold certainty. He went that same morning to find Josiah Hale, the clerk Seraphina had named as Louisa's supposed courier, and found the man packing a trunk with hands that would not stay steady, tapping his pen against the inkwell in a nervous rhythm before he had even noticed he still held it. "Mr. Hale," Alaric said, "I find I have been slow to ask you a question I ought to have asked weeks ago. Who instructed you to carry letters to the receiving house in my wife's name?" Hale's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out of it, and it was in that hesitation, more than any answer, that Alaric first heard the hairline crack in a composure that was not, after all, his own to protect. It took a fortnight to gather what could not be gathered in an hour, and every day of it pressed against the deadline like a hand against a closing door, for the bill's third reading stood fixed at Michaelmas, and Michaelmas was also the day Diana turned 18, and the trust passed wholly from Seraphina's management into her own. Alaric understood, watching the calendar with a dread he had not known himself capable of, that Seraphina needed the divorce finalized and the trust question closed before that single date, or lose both the marriage she had engineered to unravel and the fortune she had spent years quietly bleeding. He found Louisa at last through Sir Thomas's clerk, lodged plainly in a market town 2 days' ride distant, teaching a merchant's daughters their letters for her bread, and when he came to her door, she looked at him with an exhaustion so complete it frightened him more than anger would have. "You should not have come," she said. "I did not leave so that you would follow me. I came," Alaric said, "because I have your father's ledger and your father's marks in it, and because Sir Thomas tells me the alterations in Diana's trust go back 2 years before ever I knew your name, and because I am a fool who let a stolen letter matter more than 4 years of watching you tell the truth, even when it cost you." He did not ask her to come back for his sake. He asked her, instead, to come back and stand beside him at Michaelmas, not as a wife reclaimed, but as the one person in England who could read his aunt's ledgers better than his aunt herself. It was, Louisa thought, the first time anyone in that family had asked for her competence rather than her forgiveness, and it was on those terms, and no others, that she agreed to return. Diana wept when she saw her, and Mrs. Trilby jangled her keys and pretended not to weep at all, and Seraphina, informed of the return, only touched her brooch once and said, "How resourceful of her," in a voice gone very slightly thin at its edges, the first crack that anyone but Alaric had yet heard. The reckoning was held at Larkhollow 3 days before Michaelmas, in the long room where the family had always settled its formal business, before Sir Thomas Pell as trustee, before Diana, before Mrs. Trilby standing at the door with her keys silent for once in her hand, before Constance Ray, who had come uninvited and stayed when no one asked her to leave, and before Josiah Hale, brought by a constable's escort and seated apart from the rest with the particular pallor of a man who has run out of places to run to. Louisa laid the estate ledger on the table and turned it to the marked page, and beside it laid the forged letter, and asked Sir Thomas to hold both to the window light. "You will see," she said, "that the letter's paper carries a maker's mark dated to last year's stock. Though the letter itself claims a date 2 winters past, no papermaker sells tomorrow's stock into yesterday's post." Sir Thomas held the sheet to the light for a long, silent moment, and then read the watermark aloud, and the room went very still. Seraphina said, evenly, that paper was often kept in reserve for years, that this proved nothing, and it was then that Louisa turned to Josiah Hale and asked him a single question, gently, the way her father had once told her the gentlest questions do the most damage. "Mr. Hale, who paid you to copy a hand you had never before troubled to learn?" Hale looked at Seraphina once, and Seraphina did not look back at him, and that omission, more than any threat, seemed to break something in him entirely. He said her name. He said it twice, as though saying it once might not be believed, and then the rest came out of him in a rush he seemed unable to stop. The £4 6 and the years before it. The letters he had been given to trace over Louisa's genuine correspondence held up to a window pane, the payments made from an account he had been told, sworn, was authorized by the family trust. Sir Thomas produced, at that, a letter of instruction found among Hale's effects, in Seraphina's own hand, directing the transfer of trust funds to cover what it called, with chilling delicacy, household obligations of long standing, and read it aloud in full, every line, while Seraphina sat with her hands folded and her brooch untouched for the first time in 4 years, because there was, at last, nothing left in the room for her to defend. When she spoke, it was not to deny it. It was to say, in a voice suddenly stripped of all its old softness, that Reginald had left her debts no widow should have been made to carry alone, that she had only ever meant to borrow against the trust and repay it before Diana came of age, that she had watched the fortune she married into pass to a girl who did not yet know its worth, while she herself counted candle ends to keep appearances, and that she had never meant harm to come to the child. Only time, only a little more time. She touched the brooch once more as she said it, and Louisa, watching, understood suddenly that it was not vanity that made her touch it, but grief. It had been Reginald's gift to her, the last one, before the deaths and the dying, and it was the only ledger of a marriage that had cost her everything, and left her with nothing but the accounting of it. Alaric, who might once have wanted to see his aunt ruined outright, found instead that he wanted only to see the matter closed, without further wreckage. He asked Sir Thomas to arrange an annuity sufficient for a quiet life, and a house at a comfortable distance, and no charge laid before a magistrate, reasoning aloud, for the room's benefit and his own, that a public prosecution would drag Diana's trust and her family's name through every coffee-house in the county, and that mercy, here, was not kindness to Seraphina, but protection of the innocent she had so nearly ruined. Seraphina wept then, once, briefly, and did not thank him, and left the room on Mrs. Trilby's arm with a dignity that was, Louisa thought, the saddest thing she had witnessed in 4 years in that house. Constance Ray, who had sat through all of it with her gloved hands very still, rose before she left and said to Louisa, quietly, that she had come meaning to see a clerk's daughter humbled and had instead seen the truest lady in the county, and that she was sorry, and meant it, and would say so to anyone who asked. It was, for a woman who had never once softened before, as full a recanting as the room was likely to get, and Louisa took it for what it was. Alaric found Louisa afterward in the estate office, squaring the ledgers corner to corner, though there was no longer any need of tidiness, only of hands that needed something to do. He did not begin with an apology, though he owed her a great many. He said, instead, I do not require your innocence proved to me any longer, Louisa. I proved it to myself, too late, and I am sorry for every day it took me. I require, if you will still have it, that you come home, not because the deed is undone, not because Diana needs a teacher, not because the county needs a duchess who can read a ledger, though God knows this house does, but because I would rather spend the rest of my life owing you an apology I can never fully pay than spend one more day without you in the room where I keep my accounts. Louisa looked at him for a long moment, the way she had once looked at a letter written in her own stolen hand, searching for the tell beneath the surface. Your father used to say, she said at last, that every column balances in the end if you have patience for the last entry. I did not think I would live to see this one balance at all. "Marry me again, then," Alaric said, "not because the bill was withdrawn, not because it will silence anyone, not because you are owed it, but because you wish it." "It is the only reason I will take." She said yes, and outside the window a lark that had nested in the same eave for as many summers as she had lived in that house began, absurdly, to sing. And Louisa laughed for the first time in 6 weeks, and Alaric thought it the finest sound the house had made since his brother died. Sir Thomas withdrew the bill from its third reading, with a note so dry it made Mrs. Trilby snort into her tea when she heard it read aloud, and the wedding, when it came in October, was small and quiet by design, held in the same chapel where the first had happened, with twice the guests and half the meaning. Diana weeping openly through the whole of it, and Mrs. Trilby weeping and denying it in the same breath, her keys forgotten and silent in her apron pocket for once. Josiah Hale, who had cracked and confessed and thereby saved more than he had ever cost, was given a modest post in a distant county where his particular skill with a pen might be put to better use under closer watching. Constance Ray did not marry that season, or the next, choosing instead, to her father's visible despair, to travel to her aunt's house in the north and read a great many books. And wrote to Louisa once a year after, dry and funny letters that Louisa kept in a drawer of her own. Seraphina lived out her years in a small house, with a good garden and a companion of her own choosing, and sent Diana a single letter every Michaelmas, brief and formal, which Diana, in time, came to answer. Almost a year to the day after that first parting, Alaric stood once more in the library at Lark Hollow, and the door opened, and Louisa came in, not leaving this time, but arriving, a shawl about her shoulders against an ordinary autumn chill rather than a manufactured winter, a lark singing its last song of the season somewhere beyond the glass. She set a ledger on the desk before him, opened to a page with no dots beneath any of its figures at all, every column balanced, every entry honest, and she said, "Your accounts are in order, Your Grace," and he said that he had never doubted it, and meant, this time, precisely what he said. If a story about a quiet woman with a clerk's honest eye and a duke who nearly lost her to a lie has warmed some cold corner of your evening, then you are welcome to stay a while longer by this fire, where the kettle is always closer to the boil than the door is to closing. I would love to know which moment stayed with you longest, the ledger left open on his desk, the lark at the window, or the letter that finally told the truth after 4 long years of silence, so tell me in the comments, and I will read every one. Keep a chair here by the hearth if you'd like more evenings like this one. The fire tends itself, but the company is better for staying. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle as a column patient for its last entry, with anyone still waiting quietly for their truth to balance.